I want to speak to you without performance, without posture, without pretending this is easier than it is. Because if you're honest, there's a quiet tension inside you right now. A sense that something in your life is misaligned, not broken, not hopeless, just off. And you've been compensating for it by staying busy, by staying agreeable, by staying distracted. But misalignment doesn't disappear with effort. It waits. And the longer you ignore it, the louder it becomes. There's a moment that arrives for everyone who is meant to grow beyond survival. A moment where doing what's expected starts to feel heavier than doing what's true. That moment isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up as restlessness, as frustration you can't explain, as the feeling that you're capable of more, but unsure how to reach it. Most people numb that feeling. They call it impatience, or arrogance, or ungratefulness. But it's none of those. It's awareness waking up. You don't change your life when you're inspired. You change it when you're no longer willing to lie to yourself. When you admit that the version of you who made these choices is not the version of you who has to live with them forever. Growth begins with that admission. And it's uncomfortable because it removes your favorite excuse, ignorance. Once you see clearly, you're responsible. The hardest part isn't deciding what you want. It's accepting what it will cost. Because the price of alignment is always paid in advance, in awkward conversations, in temporary instability, in disappointing people who benefited from your silence, in stepping away from identities that once kept you safe. You don't lose those things because you failed. You lose them because you evolved. There's a reason the next step feels heavy. It's not because you're incapable. It's because the next step requires you to show up without guarantees, to act without applause, to choose direction over comfort. The mind wants certainty. Reality doesn't offer it. Reality offers trade-offs. And maturity is learning to choose the trade-off you can live with. You've been told to wait until you're ready. But readiness is a story people tell themselves when they're afraid to be seen trying. No one feels ready for a life that fits them. You feel clear, and clarity is quieter than confidence. Confidence asks for attention. Clarity asks for commitment. Confidence wants to be admired. Clarity wants to be accurate. When you're clear, you stop negotiating with distractions. You stop romanticizing escape. You stop waiting for permission that will never come. You realize that no one is holding you back. You are simply standing still out of habit. And habits feel like facts until you question them. Pay attention to what drains you. Not what exhausts you physically, but what depletes you internally. The meetings that feel empty. The conversations that require a mask. The goals that sound impressive but feel hollow. Those are signals, not complaints. Signals that you're investing energy in places that don't return meaning. The world rewards people who tolerate misalignment for a long time. Promotions, praise, stability. But the cost is subtle. You wake up one day and realize you've become very good at a life you don't recognize. That's the danger. Not failure, familiarity. If you're waiting for clarity to arrive before you act, you have it backwards. Action creates clarity. Movement reveals truth. Thinking in isolation only rearranges the same doubts. When you engage with reality, when you test, when you speak, when you risk being wrong, confusion starts to collapse into understanding. You don't need a complete plan. You need a direction that respects your values. You need standards that don't change based on who's watching. You need the courage to disappoint the version of you that chose comfort over growth. That version did its job. It protected you. But it's not meant to lead you forward. there will be resistance, internally and externally. Internally, your mind will remind you of everything that could go wrong. Externally, people will question your timing, your competence, your sanity. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you've stopped being predictable. And predictability is the currency of approval. Don't confuse peace with stagnation. Stillness can be clarity. But avoidance feels calm too, right up until it costs you something irreversible. Time, potential, self-respect. You feel that cost later when it's harder to undo. At some point, you have to decide whether you want a life that feels safe or a life that feels true. You can't have both indefinitely. One will eventually demand sacrifice. Choose consciously. You are not behind. You're early to the version of yourself that refuses to drift. The discomfort you feel is not a flaw in your character. It's evidence that you're paying attention, that you're no longer willing to settle for borrowed definitions of success. So stop waiting for the moment to feel right. Start with the moment that feels honest. Say the thing you've been rehearsing in silence. Take the step you've been justifying away. Remove one layer of self-deception today. Alignment isn't built in a single decision. It's built every time you choose truth over convenience. I want to speak to you slowly, deliberately, without rushing to conclusions or offering easy relief, because this isn't a message meant to motivate you for a moment. It's meant to sit with you, to unsettle you just enough that you can't go back to pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Somewhere in your life right now, something feels slightly off. Not dramatic, not broken, just misaligned. And you've learned how to live with that feeling by staying busy, by staying useful, by staying distracted. But misalignment doesn't disappear when ignored. It accumulates, quietly, patiently, until one day it demands to be acknowledged. Most people don't lack talent. They don't lack intelligence. They don't even lack opportunity. What they lack is honesty with themselves. Honest clarity about what they want, what they've outgrown, and what they're afraid to admit out loud. And the reason that honesty is so rare is because it comes with consequences. Once you see clearly, you're responsible. You can't unsee. You can't unknow. You can't keep blaming circumstances without feeling the weight of self-betrayal. There comes a point in every meaningful life where comfort starts to feel expensive, where doing what's expected begins to cost more than doing what's true. That point often arrives quietly, as restlessness, as frustration you can't explain, as the sense that you're capable of more, but unsure how to access it. Most people numb that feeling. They call it impatience, or arrogance, or ingratitude. But it's none of those. It's awareness waking up. It's the part of you that refuses to live on autopilot any longer. We've been taught to smooth things over, to wait for the right moment, to avoid discomfort in the name of stability. But there is no perfect timing for honesty. There is only courage or delay. And delay has a cost. Not immediately. That's why it's seductive. The cost shows up years later as regret, resentment, and the quiet grief of unrealized potential. Dreams don't usually die in dramatic failures. They die in silence, in conversations never had, in decisions postponed until they no longer matter. Every major shift in a person's life begins with an uncomfortable confrontation, sometimes with another person, often with themselves. A moment where excuses stop working, where narratives collapse, where you're forced to admit that the version of your life you're living no longer reflects who you are becoming. That admission is terrifying because it destabilizes identity. If you're not who you thought you were, then what comes next? That uncertainty keeps people stuck far longer than failure ever could. Discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something real. Comfort preserves. Discomfort transforms. When you sit across from someone and say what you've been holding back about your ambitions, your limits, your truth, you feel exposed. Vulnerable. But that exposure is where alignment begins. That's where your words, your actions, and your future start pointing in the same direction. Avoiding hard conversations doesn't make problems disappear. It gives them space to grow unchecked. Teams collapse not because they lack talent, but because no one is willing to say what needs to be said early enough. Relationships fail not from hatred, but from silence. Lives stagnate not from lack of ability, but from the fear of admitting that something must change. Direct conversation forces accountability. When you say something out loud, it becomes real. You can't hide from it anymore. You can't pretend you didn't know. That's why honesty feels heavy. It removes the illusion of innocence. It draws a line in time. Before, you were drifting. After, you're responsible. This isn't about being loud or aggressive. It's about being precise. Calm. Relentless. The most powerful conversations aren't emotional explosions. They're moments of quiet intensity where excuses don't survive. Where you look someone in the eye and say, "This matters to me," and whether they agree or not, reality shifts. Because clarity has weight. Confidence is overrated. Confidence can be loud, persuasive, charismatic. Confidence can fool people, including you. But clarity is different. Clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't seek approval. It doesn't need permission. Clarity moves quietly and relentlessly, and it wins over time. Confidence depends on mood. Clarity depends on understanding. Many people chase confidence because they want to feel ready before they begin. But readiness is a myth. You don't become clear by waiting. You become clear by engaging, by thinking, by testing, by failing and refining. Clarity is built through action, not affirmation. If confidence were required to do something new, nothing new would ever exist. When you understand your purpose deeply enough, motivation becomes irrelevant. You don't wake up asking how you feel. You wake up knowing what needs to be done. Clarity creates discipline. It anchors you when emotions fluctuate. Some days you'll feel unstoppable, other days depleted. Confidence disappears on the hard days. Clarity doesn't. The world doesn't reward the loudest voice. It rewards the clearest thinker. People follow clarity into uncertainty far more willingly than they follow confidence into chaos. Teams don't need leaders who always feel sure. They need leaders who are honest about reality, risks, and priorities. If you feel stuck, it's rarely because you lack confidence. It's because something is unclear. Your goal, your standards, your priorities. Somewhere, you're avoiding a hard question. And the moment you ask it honestly, momentum begins to build. Confusion drains energy. Clarity creates it. Most people are not limited by resources. They are limited by the need for permission, the need to be approved, to be told explicitly or implicitly that they're allowed to think bigger. And that need quietly suffocates every extraordinary version of their life. No one is coming to authorize your ambition. There is no committee deciding when you're ready. If you wait for approval, you will spend your life watching less capable people move forward simply because they didn't ask. Every breakthrough idea sounds unreasonable before it works. That's why approval is such a terrible filter. If you need everyone to agree before you act, you guarantee that you'll only do what's already been done. Progress doesn't ask for consensus. It asks for courage. Thinking beyond permission means accepting that you will be misunderstood. You will be doubted. You may be laughed at. That's not a flaw in the process. That is the process. If what you're doing makes everyone comfortable, it's probably not transformative. Some of the most important decisions you'll ever make will feel lonely. Quietly lonely. The kind where you can explain your reasoning clearly, but people still ask why. And all you can say is because it has to be done. That's when you find out whether you live by conviction or by permission. Builders act before they're validated, not because they're arrogant, but because they're loyal to truth over popularity. They listen. They think. They adjust. But they don't outsource responsibility for their lives to consensus. Validation, if it comes, comes later. Many people live borrowed lives. They inherit goals, definitions of success, timelines, fears. They borrow expectations and then wonder why nothing feels like theirs. A borrowed life can look stable, but it feels hollow. Building a life from first principles requires asking a dangerous question. Why am I doing this at all? Not why is this expected? Not why do people like me do this? But why, fundamentally? First principles thinking strips away tradition and assumption until only reality remains. When you apply that thinking to your life, it becomes disruptive. You realize many of the rules you've been following were never laws. They were habits, defaults, someone else's comfort zone. When you build from first principles, problems stop feeling like identity threats and start feeling like engineering challenges. Failure becomes feedback. You're no longer defending a story. You're solving a puzzle. And that shift is liberating. A borrowed life feels busy but directionless. A first principles life feels demanding but meaningful. You stop chasing validation. You start creating value. You become selective, focused, relentless. And paradoxically, when you stop copying, you start contributing. Fear will show up the moment you approach something that matters. Not because you're weak, but because you're close. Fear is not a stop sign. It's information. It tells you where the edge of your current identity is. The mistake is treating fear like an order instead of data. Fear thrives in vagueness. It loses power and clarity. When you name risks specifically, they become manageable. When you leave them abstract, they become paralyzing. Learn to distinguish danger from discomfort. Growth always feels risky because it threatens the familiar. But familiar is not the same as safe. The people who do remarkable things are not fearless. They are skilled at moving while afraid. They let fear sharpen their thinking instead of shrinking their ambition. They extract the data, then move forward anyway. Responsibility is the final step most people avoid. Because responsibility removes the ability to blame. It means standing in front of the future and saying, "This is mine to influence." Responsibility is heavy, but it's also where power comes from. The future is not something that happens to you. It's built slowly, daily, through decisions. When enough people avoid responsibility, the future decays. When a few take responsibility anyway, the future bends. You don't need to fix everything. You need to fix something. To take ownership where you can. To stop waiting for perfect conditions. Responsibility doesn't require certainty. It requires commitment. Comfort can make you happy for a while. Responsibility makes you useful. And usefulness is deeply satisfying. When you take responsibility, you stop being a victim of circumstances and start being a participant in outcomes. So if something in your life feels heavy, ask whether it's foundational or inherited. If a path feels draining, ask whether it's built on truth or expectation. Strip it down. Rebuild it deliberately. You don't need a dramatic reinvention. You need intellectual honesty. Stop borrowing your life. Stop waiting for permission. Stop confusing fear with intuition. Have the conversation you've been avoiding with someone else, with yourself. Say the hard thing. Ask the dangerous question. Choose direction over comfort. Your life won't change all at once, but it will change trajectory, and trajectory is everything. The moment you stop avoiding discomfort is the moment your life starts accelerating. Progress doesn't begin with inspiration. It begins with honesty. What people rarely talk about after the first awakening is what comes next. Because realization is dramatic, but integration is quiet. The moment you see the truth of your life, the misalignment, the avoidance, the borrowed goals, there's a surge of clarity. It feels powerful. But then the real work begins. And this is where most people stall. Not because they don't know what to do, but because knowing creates pressure. Pressure to act consistently. Pressure to change patterns. Pressure to become someone new without applause. After clarity, there is friction. Internal friction. You start noticing how often your actions contradict what you now understand. You see yourself saying yes when you mean no. You feel the drag of habits that no longer fit. And that tension is exhausting. Many people interpret that exhaustion as a sign they were wrong to question their life. They mistake the discomfort of transition for failure. But it's not failure, it's recalibration. When you begin aligning your life with truth, everything slows down before it speeds up. Progress feels clumsy. You lose efficiency because you're no longer running on autopilot. You're thinking again, choosing again, and choice takes energy. This phase can feel like regression because you're no longer numbing yourself with momentum. But what you're actually doing is rebuilding your foundation. There's also grief here. Quiet grief. Grief for the years spent pursuing things that didn't matter. Grief for versions of yourself that kept you safe but small. Grief for relationships that only worked when you were less honest. This grief doesn't mean you were foolish. It means you were human. You did the best you could with the awareness you had. Now you have more awareness. And that changes the rules. One of the hardest truths to accept is that alignment will cost you people. Not through conflict necessarily, but through distance. When you stop performing, some connections weaken. When you stop agreeing, some dynamics dissolve. And this can feel like loss, even when it's necessary. You might question yourself, wonder if you're becoming selfish or difficult. But growth often looks like selfishness to people who benefited from your self-abandonment. You'll also notice resistance from within. Parts of you that say, slow down, don't ruin what's working, don't overthink this. Those voices aren't enemies, they're protectors. They kept you safe when certainty mattered more than meaning. Thank them. But don't let them drive anymore. Safety is no longer your highest value. Truth is. As you move forward, you'll realize that clarity doesn't eliminate fear. It refines it. The fear becomes more specific, more intelligent. You're no longer afraid of everything. You're afraid of particular outcomes. And that's progress. Specific fear can be planned around. Vague fear cannot. You start asking better questions. Not, what if this fails? But what would failure actually look like? Not, what will people think? But who actually needs to understand this? Not, am I ready? But what's the next honest step? These questions shift you from emotional paralysis to practical movement. At this stage, discipline becomes essential. Not rigid discipline, but values-based discipline. You can't rely on motivation because motivation fades. You rely on standards. You decide in advance what you tolerate, what you commit to, what you walk away from. This reduces decision fatigue. It creates internal trust. You stop negotiating with yourself every day. Internal trust is underrated. When you repeatedly act against your own clarity, you erode self-respect. When you follow through, even imperfectly, you rebuild it. Confidence grows not from success, but from keeping promises to yourself, especially the small ones. Another shift happens quietly. You stop explaining yourself as much, not because you don't care, but because you realize explanation is often a request for approval disguised as communication. You still communicate, you still listen, but you stop over-justifying. You understand that clarity doesn't need consensus to be valid. This doesn't make you rigid. It makes you grounded. You become more open to feedback because your identity isn't on trial anymore. When you're clear about your values, criticism becomes information, not a threat. You can take what's useful and discard the rest without spiraling. You'll also notice your tolerance for noise decreases. Meaningless business, endless comparison, performative urgency. It all starts to feel heavy. Not because it's wrong, but because it's irrelevant to what you're building. You become more selective with your attention. And attention is life's most valuable resource. At some point, you'll realize that alignment doesn't make life easier. It makes it cleaner. Fewer contradictions, fewer internal arguments, fewer regrets. The challenges remain, but they're honest challenges. You're no longer fighting yourself on top of fighting the world. This is also where responsibility deepens. Not responsibility as obligation, but responsibility as agency. You stop asking who's to blame and start asking what's possible. You stop waiting for conditions to improve and start improving conditions where you are. This mindset is subtle but transformative. It turns frustration into design. Design thinking applied to life changes everything. Instead of asking, why am I like this? You ask what system produced this behavior. Instead of judging yourself, you engineer better environments, better routines, better inputs. You stop moralizing your struggles and start solving them. And slowly, something shifts. You feel less reactive, less desperate for outcomes, more focused on process. You care deeply, but not frantically. You're committed without being attached to immediate validation. This is maturity, but not emotional detachment, but emotional regulation anchored in purpose. You also realize that alignment is not a destination. It's a practice. You will drift again. Everyone does. New habits become old habits. New clarity becomes new comfort. The difference now is that you notice faster. You correct sooner. You don't let years pass before adjusting. This is why growth accelerates. Not because life gets easier, but because course corrections happen earlier. Small misalignments are addressed before they become crises. Conversations happen before resentment hardens. Decisions are made before options disappear. Eventually, you become someone others sense clarity in. Not because you talk about it, but because your actions are coherent. Your words match your priorities. Your boundaries are calm. Your direction is visible even when the path is uncertain. This kind of clarity is rare, and people respond to it instinctively. Some will be inspired. Some will be threatened. Neither is your responsibility. Your responsibility is to remain honest, to continue choosing truth over convenience, to keep building a life that feels internally aligned, even when it's externally challenging. And there will be moments when you're tired, when the weight of responsibility feels heavy, when it would be easier to drift again. In those moments, remember why you started. Not the image, not the outcome, the integrity, the relief of not lying to yourself anymore, the quiet dignity of living deliberately. Alignment doesn't promise happiness every day. It promises meaning, and meaning is sustainable. Meaning holds when motivation fades. Meaning holds when things go wrong. Meaning holds when you're alone with your thoughts. So if part one was about waking up, part two is about staying awake, about doing the unglamorous work of living what you now understand, about choosing consistency over intensity, truth over performance, responsibility over comfort. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You just need to keep choosing the next honest step, over and over. That's how lives change. Not in moments of inspiration, but in sustained alignment with reality.